Most of my background and most of my work is usually on health insurance side, doing ACA and health reform type issues. But I've been assigned to carry this bill, so I will be new to many of you. I'm kind of new. I know some of you, probably many of you, but you know, the TPA space and the PBM space and some of these other issues are a bit new to me. So just sort of by way of disclaimer, I kind of come from the healthcare world, so I sort of tend to see things through that lens. So if you're coming from a different perspective, and maybe, just understand that maybe it might take me a minute to catch up. So we are going to forego, just because we have so many people on, we're not going to do introductions. But I'm going to go ahead and just start running through our agenda. And we're going to start with just a little bit of housekeeping, because we do have a lot of folks online today. So we ask that you keep your lines muted and your video off unless you are speaking. That just kind of helps preserve bandwidth, make sure everybody can access the meeting. Normally, I'm the kind of guy who doesn't mind taking questions as I go, but because we do have so many people, I think we're going to ask that everybody just hold their questions. We've got kind of a dedicated section on our agenda where we'll sort of open things up for discussion. But I've got some help today, and we're going to keep everybody muted. And I'm just kind of going to run through some background on the bill and some high-level things, work through our agenda, and then we will open it up. So if folks have questions, you're welcome to ask them at that point. When we get to that point, do please raise your hand to speak. We've got to try to keep. We want to keep it to where only one person's talking at a time. And if you can, try to remember to introduce yourself, both your name and the organization you're with. And, might be helpful a little bit to just, if it's not obvious from the name, kind of let us know what type of company you're with, where, whether you're with maybe an insurer or a consumer group, whoever you're sort of representing. And a lot of people ask, so we are recording the meeting today. So we're going to keep, I believe Teams has a recording function. We're going to have a video recording, and we will distribute that as well as these slides that I'm talking through right now after the session. It might take a little bit, because I understand we're going to have to actually post the video to our website and then send out a link to where it's posted on our website. So it won't be like immediately after the meeting, but we will get that out to everybody. And then last, I just want to acknowledge, and this is kind of my bad, I'm a little Oregon focused, mostly, like I said, I deal mostly with our regional domestic health carriers. So it didn't occur to me when I scheduled this at 3 p.m. that I would have to account for the time change. So I know there were some folks on the East Coast who weren't able to attend or thought the meeting was earlier than it was. So I apologize for that. And we'll keep that in mind. If we have additional meetings, I'll make an effort to make sure we schedule those in the morning, such that our friends on the East Coast can join us. So I'm going to start to get around the concept. I think it was good just to sort of level set, and I want to talk a little bit about what current Oregon law has to say about third-party administrators. That'll just kind of give everybody a baseline understanding, and then we'll move from that into kind of where we see gaps or issues with our current regulatory scheme, and then into what we're proposing to do about that. And then we'll dive into the draft that I sent out to kind of specifically walk through the very specific changes that we're putting on the table today. Want to keep everybody, just a reminder, that is a discussion draft. We're open to changes. This is the first time I think folks are seeing this. We've been working on this for a while, so we know some things might need to change. So kind of, approach the conversation from that spirit. So to dig into current Oregon law, so our third-party administrator statutes are found at ORS 744-700 to 744-740. For the most part, Oregon follows the NAIC guideline on third-party administrator regulation. And that is to say, it really focuses on TPAs that administer fully insured plans. In Oregon, we only license TPAs when they operate in conjunction with life and health insurance coverage. So if by chance you join this meeting, you work with a TPA for workers' compensation or stop loss or something in the property casualty world, good news, you can probably log off, as we don't anticipate the bill having any impacts on you. We're really looking at the life and health lines when we talk about TPAs in Oregon. We also currently maintain exemptions, and this is consistent with the NAIC model. We have exemptions for authorized insurers and for third-party administrators that solely work with self-funded plans. And our current fees for a TPA license are only $45. So those are pretty low, particularly relative to other state fees and frankly, relative to some of the effort and cost that we're putting into our third-party administrator oversight. This real quickly is just the definition of transacting business as a third-party administrator in Oregon. So key phrasing here is a person transacts or purports or offers to transact business as a third-party administrator when the person directly or indirectly solicits or affects coverage of, underwrites, collects charges or premiums from, or adjusts or settles claims on residents of the state or residents of another state from offices in the state, as I said, in connection with life insurance or health insurance coverage. So that's sort of the baseline definition that is aligned with the NAIC model. I think that's how most states define what it is to be a third-party administrator. Second piece of our law, where, as I said earlier, we generally align with the NAIC model. One area, which we'll talk about a little bit more, where we don't fully follow the NAIC model is where we talk about the responsibilities of insurers using third-party administrators. Our law just takes a small sliver of the NAIC model and says that an insurer is solely responsible for providing competent administration of its programs. That is a little bit more limited. We'll look at that more. I've got that in the draft language, but just wanted to flag that. This is all we have in Oregon law currently is sort of a vague statement that insurer is solely responsible for competent administration and doesn't really get into, who's on point for which regulatory obligations or compliance obligations. And that has become problematic for us because we have had situations where an insurer was using a TPA. We went to investigate that, insurer, and we kind of gotten a little bit of the, both parties pointing to the other one. The TPA says talk to the insurer says talk to the TPA. So that's one issue I think we're going to look at addressing in the bill. A second issue, and this is consistent with NIC, so our current law exempts third-party administrators that work solely with self-funded ERISA plans from licensure. So we have an exemption if all you do as a TPA is work with the ERISA plans, the self-funded employer plans, we say you don't have to be licensed in Oregon. We just have a registration requirement, which is something less than full licensure. The issues we're seeing here is what I'm calling here create something of a regulatory blind spot. Here's what we know is that we have very few TPAs that are currently registered with us as a self-funded TPA. I think we have fewer than 40. And of those 40, many of them are, I'll say, interrelated in the sense that, it seems to be sort of they all have similar contact information. So we are concerned that maybe we probably aren't capturing that whole market, so that those provisions that say you have to be registered as a TPA perhaps aren't being followed as often as they are. A second concern here has been that creates certain opportunities for not so much what I would think of as our good faith above board insurers, but we have had some scenarios in the last few years where we had some fraudulent activity, frankly, some scams. And one component of those scams was you had one entity or another claiming to be a third-party administrator for a self-funded plan and therefore outside our jurisdiction. Eventually things played out. We started getting consumer complaints. They kind of give us the runaround. A little bit later down the road, it becomes clear that something really nasty was going on. And the last point that I bring up here, and this is sort of one that's more specific to our health insurance carriers, and I think probably warrants more of a dedicated discussion with our health insurance carriers. But this is continuing to be something of a thorn on our side. Is we have a lot of consumers who come to us with complaints or issues Maybe they think their claim hasn't been handled appropriately. Maybe their claim hasn't been paid timely. They don't think they've gotten appropriate appeals or grievances treatment. And, they come to us and we contact the insurer, and it turns out, well, it's the insurer is not actually acting as an insurer in that case, but they are the TPA for some other self-funded entity. Often this is called administrative services only, or ASO, or, there are other phrases, but the idea here is, to the consumer, they think a given company is their insurance company, but in fact, that company is really just acting as a TPA, and therefore, we're unwilling to resolve their complaint, and in many cases, we're unable to even get good information back from the insurer. So that's one of those are sort of the issues we're seeing around sort of our registration and the exemption for self-funded TPAs. Another aspect of Oregon law that I think is something we want to look at for the bill is sort of reconciling our current TPA regulation with some of the things we've done in more recent years with pharmacy benefit managers. As I kind of quoted earlier, if you go back to that definition of what it means to be a TPA in Oregon, it talks about, processing claims, or, sort of basically running insurance programs, paying benefits, processing claims, things like that. I think if you look at that and you think about what a pharmacy benefit manager does, you would tend to assume, well, that seems to be describing the pharmacy benefit manager. But at the same time, we also have a dedicated set of pharmacy benefit manager statutes that talk about, registration. That's in ORS 735-532. And then 735-533 talks about criteria for denying, suspending, or revoking a PBM registration. So there's something of an ambiguity right now between, is a PBM a TPA? Is it just a PBM and not a TPA? And, that is something that I think we are hoping to clarify in the bill. I will go ahead and say I think the division's position on this is and has been that a PBM is a TPA because it seems to fit the definition of TPA. But we also realize that does put, kind of a strange position where, if you're a PBM, you have to both be registered and licensed. So that's one of the issues we're looking at to talk about in the bill. So, and we'll dig deeper on, so that's sort of the background and kind of the divisions where we're sort of coming from with this concept. The high level, this is sort of the high level summary of things we've identified to address in the bill. Number one is increasing those fees from $45 to more correctly reflect what it's actually costing us to administer TPA licensure and oversight. Number two, clarify the enforcement piece and sort of the regulatory obligations. So clarify that insurers that use TPAs are responsible for the acts of their TPAs, consistent with the NAIC guideline. Number three, and realizing this one might be controversial, we would like to require that all entities that act as TPAs in Oregon be licensed with us. So doing away with that distinction between licensure and registration, and just say, everybody if you're doing TPA work in Oregon, we would like you to be licensed as such with us. And that would apply primarily to health insurers, which are currently exempt, and those TPAs that are out there that are currently taking advantage of that exemption, where it says, if you're only doing the self-funded business, you only have to be registered, where we're seeing such low turnout. And then lastly, kind of as I talked about earlier, we are interested in clarifying, the requirements for pharmacy benefit managers, resolving that sort of disconnect between the PBM statutes and our TPA licensure. So that's kind of the preface. The next part of what I'd like to do with the meeting is walk through what we have so far. And again, as I said earlier, I want to reiterate, this is just a draft. We're looking for feedback on essentially everything we're going to talk about, good and bad. If you think we need to go further, if there are issues we haven't talked about that folks might want to bring to us, we'd be willing to hear about that. And also, obviously, any feedback on, any of what we're putting on the table today. And so then I also just wanted to give a quick note for folks that may have heard or seen this. So our TPA concept, we consider it a legislative concept at this stage in Oregon because it hasn't actually been introduced yet, but it has been given the number LC 433. We have not, as a division, really published or kind of put that out there because I think from our perspective, we're largely viewing that bill that's out there as a placeholder. And I really just say this so for anyone who might have come across it or might go looking for it, that, yes, we've got something out there, but I think our goal as part of this process is to, through a series of meetings to try to come to something like a consensus-1 amendment that we could, that the stakeholder groups, everyone can kind of feel good with, and that we think we can take into session and hopefully pass without significant controversy. So with that, I am going to switch over, excuse me, and I'm going to pull up now. This is the discussion draft. So this is sort of our first crack at some of the changes we would propose to be making. And I'm just going to kind of walk through, from our perspective, what's here, why it's here. And then after we get through that, I'm going to open it up and we can start to have some conversation. So first thing that we're changing, and this is pretty significant in kind of what we've been contemplating, is moving away. So as I said earlier, our current statutes really focus on insurers. And a lot of the TPA provisions talk about, the relationship between an insurer and a TPA. We want to move that, at least in certain cases, to talk about payer, which is a broader category. So as it says here, that would be an insurer or basically an employer administering an employee benefit plan. So that would get at essentially the self-funded plans. And this language, this is how the NAIC model, the NAIC model uses payor as its kind of key phrase. And so I just want to flag that there's a distinction as we walk through this between when we use the word insurer, which refers solely to fully insured insurance plans, and the broader term payor, which, would refer to the, not include insured and self-funded plans. Next section, so this is our license statute. What I'm proposing here in 702 sub 3 is to kind of we have this language already that just sort of talks somewhat generically about nothing in the TPA statutes exempt a TPA from any other applicable licensing requirement. And because we're moving towards, looking at payers, we wanted to make clear that in having insurers that do TPA work licenses TPAs, we were going to make clear to add insurer and pharmacy benefit manager here, so that makes clear that those entities, if you're both of those things, you remain subject to both requirements. Next piece is 704. This is the exemptions from the TPA license requirement. So this gets at two pieces. So sub E here, I think it's sub 1E, talks about insurers that are authorized to transact insurance in the state being exempt from the TPA law. We're proposing to change that to more narrowly only exempt insurers that do not act as a third-party administrator on behalf of another payer. So the idea there is if you're an insurer, even if you are an insurer, even if you're licensed, you're under certificate of authority, if you're doing TPA business, we would want you to be licensed as a TPA with us. Moving down in sub L here, this is the exemption for the TPAs that solely do ERISA self-funded plans. And as I discussed earlier, we would propose to remove that. The next change that we're looking at in sub O, so since we are kind of expanding into that self-funded market, we wanted to put in a little carve back out a few things that we didn't think we wanted to capture. So this section just makes clear that things like health savings accounts, flexible spending accounts, and health reimbursement arrangements, if all you're doing is administering those programs, we would still exempt those. We don't really think of those as central to what we're looking at in terms of TPAs. And I put a question on this one over on the side, kind of a question that came up recently in conversations that I'd like some input on if people have thoughts is, should that also exempt entities that basically COBRA administrators, right? So entities that administer continuation coverage under group health plans, whether that be state continuation or the federal COBRA. So that's the exemption changes. The next piece is where we talk about license, and this is really where we get at the fee piece that I mentioned earlier. So here I was proposing in 706 to add a sub 3 and basically address the fee issues. And what this says here is we would basically establish a higher fee than what we're paying. Like I said, it's about $45 currently. We would put a dollar amount and then under sub 3A and then also under 3B. The idea here is that we would basically set a statutory dollar amount in the bill, but then also retain authority if we needed to raise that by rule. And then the point of sub 4 here is basically, although we would expect pharmacy benefit managers to be licensed as TPAs, we would not want to subject them to both that increased TPA fee, and we fairly recently established a PBM fee. So kind of the goal of sub 4 here would be to not apply, not double ding the PBM, say that yes, you have to be licensed as a TPA, but you would still only pay that fee that we've already established under the 735s. The majority, the next few sections here are, well, sorry, let me slow down. Then in 744, 714, this is where we talk about the registration requirement. So earlier, there's the language that exempts the self-funded TPAs from the licensure requirement. This is the provision that would say, well, yes, you don't have to be licensed, but you do have to be registered. Since we're talking about having everything licensed, we would remove that and subject everybody to the licensing statute or the licensing requirement. And then as we move down, we're not, and I want to flag this because I think this is important. So when we get into some of the more what I would consider substantive obligations for a TPA in Oregon, we are not proposing to expand any of those to payors. So where I talked earlier about how, you have the insurers, which are your licensed insurance companies, and then the broader category of payer that includes insurers and employer plans, we would just keep this at insurer, such that it's an agreement between an insurer and a third-party administrator. So to the extent that there are already existing requirements on the agreements there between the insurers and its TPAs, nothing would change in those statutes. And that would remain consistent for, the other obligations here, 722, relationship of insurer and third-party administrator regarding payments. Our books and records statute, again, would still only apply in the case of fully insured plans. Advertising, disposition of charges. I did put a note on errors and omissions just to flag that I think that might be an open question, whether that should be only, whether we would want to require, a TPA if you're only doing the self-funded, should you also have the E&O insurance? Which was, one area where I thought, well, that might be something we want to think about. Again, advertising, no changes. Disposition of changes or charges and premiums, no changes. Contingent fee agreements, no changes. Notices to insureds, etc. Annual report. And then we get down to, this is the last section. So this is where we talk about responsibilities of insurers using third-party administrators. And this is the piece where it used to just say an insurer is solely responsible for providing competent administration of its programs. We would propose to expand this with some additional obligations. all of this would align with the NAIC model, such that it says an insurer uses the services of TPA, is responsible for the acts of its TPA, and is responsible for providing the TPA's books and records relevant to be insured to the director upon request. Written agreement shall provide for communications to avoid deceptive statements. Number 4, in the event of a dispute between insurer regarding which of them is to fulfill a lawful obligation with respect to a policy, certificate, or claim subject to the written agreement, the insurer shall fulfill such obligation. So that is really the key piece where it clarifies that, look, if the TPA and the insurer disagree about who's supposed to do something that they know they need to do, at the end of the day, the ultimate compliance obligation would stay with the insurer. And 5, this basically reinserts that same language where it says the payer has the duty to provide for competent administration. And that, again, that would basically, currently that's the only piece of this language that we have in law. As I noted earlier, we've had some issues there, so we would like to go ahead and adopt all of the NAIC model. So that's kind of what we have on the table today. I surely realize that probably raises some issues. So I would like to go ahead and at this point, we could start to take some comments. Excuse me, let me get back to my PowerPoint. And kind of the way I would like to organize this, because we do have so many people, just in the name of trying to, rather than have everybody go at once, I'd kind of like to hear from the groups in sort of this order. So first up, the current TPAs and TPA registrants, then like to hear from pharmacy benefit managers, then insurers, and then would like to open it up to anyone else. And again, as I said earlier, I'm mostly familiar with the insurance side of this, so these are, as I was drafting it, these are the key kind of components where things would really be changing. So those are kind of the ones I flagged, but I certainly don't want to leave anybody out if there are issues I haven't thought about or considered. So with that, I guess we could go ahead and take comments. Oh, excuse me, I'm trying to. I will stop sharing my screen and we can go ahead and I would open up the floor. If anybody with the TPA has any comments or questions they'd like to ask at this point, if you could raise your hand and introduce yourself and we could take those comments. You're also welcome to drop them in the chat if you prefer. Anybody? So I do see I've got one question, chance. Can you specify the NAIC model you are referencing in the document? Yes, it is the, I said model, and I think it's actually technically a guideline, but it is titled Registration and Regulation of Third-Party Administrators. It's an NAIC guideline, and I do have a copy of that. There's a link, when I send out the presentation, I put a link to the model, the guideline, excuse me, in the end of that document. So you can link it from there, but it's available on the NAIC website. If you just Google NAIC model law TPA, it will come up fairly quickly. Okay, seeing nothing from TPAs, I will ask if anybody, oh, sorry, Allison Thompson, let's see if we can, I think we should have you unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, how are you doing? I'm one of the people on the East Coast, so I'm driving home as I'm listening to this. And I'm with the VIA Management Solutions in Kentucky, and we were recently licensed this year. The only question I have is, what kind of fees are you looking at? What's the percentage, or do you have a number in mind as to what you're going to increase them from next year, just so that I can report back to my folks about, expected costs next year?
Yeah, so I apologize. I should have covered that when I was walking through the draft. I put it in one of the comments. So we've been looking at other states. We've done some kind of preliminary research. Like I said, we're at about $45. We've seen a lot of other states that are at, $200-300, per year. So what I would throw out as a sort of a starting point was, and keep in mind our TPA license renews biannually, so it's a 2-year renewal period. What I was going to, just for, to give some sense to stakeholders, I was going to say $200 per year. So that would be the equivalent of $400 for a 2-year renewal period. So yeah, I hope that seems reasonable. We think that's kind of in line with what we've seen in other states as we've looked. But anyways, that's, happy to take comments on that if that feels high, that feels low, or how that affects people. But that, to give sort of a stalking horse, that's sort of what I would toss out today.
Okay, and that is, I mean, we just went through a lot of different licensing, so I have seen this spectrum of prices, and I really don't think that that's out of alignment. So that's great. Thank you.
Hi, Michael, you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. How long have I been muted?
Just after the response. So
Okay.
just say what you were saying again.
Sorry, I was going to say if we could. Rick Blackwell had his hand up, but I was saying if anybody else from a TPA had anything that they wanted to say, before we move into health insurance, I was just trying to keep it a little bit structured. If anyone else had questions from a TPA sort of perspective.
You're in luck, Michael, because I'm asking for Pacific Source Administrators, who is a TPA. So
I shut my face. Go ahead.
I was curious if the department, as part of this, has done a fee study to look at the kind of the expected revenue and possible reserves that the fee would bring in, so we have a kind of a sense of what the department needs in terms of regulation.
We have not done a full fee study. What we've done at this point was, we did sort of a survey of what other states are charging for TPAs, and kind of to get a rough sense. I kind of wanted to get through this meeting, and I'm glad I got the question actually, that to give a sense of kind of roughly what we're looking at. I kind of wanted to take the temperature and see how that sounded. But I think we would. I think we're open to that in terms of making sure that it's appropriate. We definitely know where we're at now is probably too low. So it is sort of an open question of how high does it go. We were kind of using what other states are charging as something of a benchmark on that, knowing that if you're putting in statute, you might want to err a little bit high, just from the standpoint of you don't want to have to come back and update it again in rules in 2 or 3 years. But I don't know that I can say we've done a fee study yet.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I mean, as a follow-up, I mean, does the department know or expect what the increase in workload would be as a result of the changes to the statute?
I don't think I can speak to that, but I could take that back to my licensing manager and see what we could come back with on that. Oh, I've got Jason Flanagan as one of our licensing leads. Jason, did you have something to say on that?
Yeah, as far as for the licensing section of it, probably not a huge difference. I mean, obviously I think there's 39 are currently registered ERISA or ERISA TPAs. So obviously there would be 39 applications for those because they don't have to apply as TPAs now, and they would after this change. But otherwise, I don't think for the licensing bit, it would really change a ton other than right now. I mean, I do all the TPA licensing for Oregon, and it takes, there's a lot that goes into it. And $45 is not nearly adequate to cover the time that I spend, let alone if we have to do any other kind of oversight or regulation.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, hearing none, I will, Mary Ann Cooper.
Hi, I don't think we've had the opportunity to meet yet. I am brand new to the government relations role at Cambia. And I imagine that we will have some comments, but I have not had a chance to have this internally reviewed yet. So I know you may cover that at the end, but if we can maybe have a couple weeks to return some thoughts to you, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah, appreciate it. Yeah,
Awesome.
just to say the obvious, yeah, I realizing I just got it to you this morning. It's the end of a long day for many of us, so I realize I'm throwing an awful lot at you late in the day. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit, but yeah, absolutely want to give a good, robust window, get people's eyeballs on this and give some good time to comment, and then we'll all come back and kind of an iterative process. So absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Anybody else? I guess we're opening up to PBMs or TPAs at this point.
Michael, this is Tanya Neal with the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association.
Hi there.
We are the National Association for PBMs. I just had a quick question. In your draft, it says licensure or register or certification. Are you thinking that there would be a licensing process in addition to the certification at some point?
I think what we're saying is, I think the intent of that is to make clear, specifically in the PBM case, because you do have the certificate or the registration requirement and the ORS 735. Under what I put in the discussion draft today, the model would be you would have to be licensed as a TPA. We would make it explicit that, yes, we think you have to be licensed as a TPA. To the extent that's been not a clear question in the past, the goal would be to make that super clear. One way of making that clear was adding in there that, yes, you would need to basically be licensed as a TPA, as a PBM, and then also you would still be subject to the certification requirement. Now, I want to be clear, like I added the PBM licensing statute to the end of the draft just for reference. I did not propose any changes in that section at this point, but I kind of wanted to just break introduce the idea, and to make clear, I think we would be open to feedback, comments, or thoughts about how to, if we went there and said, yes, a PBM needs to be licensed as a TPA, what, if any, conforming changes might we need to make in 735 to kind of avoid that thing where you're sort of subject under two different statutory bodies. That's the model we're proposing today is, yes, PBMs would be TPAs. They need to be licensed as TPAs. And then, we could, there may be things we could change to, in the certification side, maybe remove the certification requirement or incorporate that into the TPAs. You might say, well, you're a TPA with a PBM designation, for example, something like that. But I didn't put anything in the draft on that, but that's not to say we're not open to talking about how best to resolve this. I think in the PBM space, I think that's our primary kind of where we're coming from is we realize we've sort of got these two somewhat conflicting, not totally reconcilable statutes out there, and we're interested in resolving that, I guess.
So, having never seen what the requirements are for licensure for a TPA or what the testing might be, I would maybe ask that we have a lot of conversation around that conversation, because there's a whole lot that a TPA does that a PBM does not. And so I think there's a whole lot of separate entities there that we wouldn't want to get caught under, because we have no intention of ever doing a lot of that extra stuff.
Yeah, and I'll say I understood. To back up, just to kind of understand where we're coming from is, because we do sort of have this bit of it's really that language about what a TPA is, what it means to be a TPA, which does involve payment of claims. So I think historically the division's view has been that, yes, a PBM is a TPA or should be. And so, faced with that, you basically have three options, right? You can leave it ambiguous and unclear. You can resolve it by saying, no, a PBM is not a TPA, and here's all the stuff a PBM has to do. Or you can say, yes, a PBM is a TPA, but then you don't really need that certification. Why would you need, you don't really need the two different statutes. So the model I went with, just to really kind of kick off the conversation today, was stick with what we've sort of said historically, push it into the TPA statutes. But I agree with you. I in no way do I think that's a final word, what I put in that draft today.
Okay, thank you. We look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you. Tom Holt.
Hey, Michael. Tom Holt for the Oregon Association of Health Underwriters. Just at kind of a 50,000-foot level, I mean, beyond, aligning with NAIC model, but it looks like you're basically moving from registration to licensure on TPA and PBM on this, which gives you some more regulatory tools. Was there a policy concern or public policy concern really driving this, or is this, maybe more toward a update because NAIC adopted a model?
Well, yeah, yes is the answer to the question. I think part of the challenge of this bill, I can't give you just one overarching policy concern, right? I think we've had a variety of issues crop up in the TPA space, right? So things like, the sort of the confusion for the PBMs, the ambiguity on the enforcement, because we have had enforcement scenarios where, without a clear statute saying who's ultimately responsible, it has been a little difficult to navigate. When we've had issues on plans when we think Bankley, the TPA might not have been compliant, but wasn't totally clear if we could enforce that directly against the TPA or the insurer. And then, like I said earlier, with some of the self-funded issues, we've just had a sort of a variety of issues where not having the self-funded plans license is proven problematic. So from, the issue I mentioned about, potentially, we have had some situations of entities purporting to be TPAs for self-funded plans that we ultimately found out didn't actually exist. And some Oregon consumers got taken for the ride. If we had had a TPA licensing statute, we could have said, where's your TPA license, right? That alone would have been given us, the tools we needed to shut that down. So those are sort of the things that I think each one of these is sort of trying to fix a slightly different problem. But I do think we have, reasoning under, there are reasons we want to do all of this, I would say.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I guess we could open it up to health insurers as well at this point, if anybody has a comment or question. Dave Nestor-Cass.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? See me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So Dave Nestor-Cass with Moda Health Plan and Delta Dental of Oregon. So just thinking about this removal of the insurer exemption, and I'm still kind of thinking through it, but a couple of things I'd like to at least sort of put out as the discussion points are, well, one, you mentioned how that might relate to the handling of, I think you kind of tied these together, kind of the handling of complaints that come in and from an individual who's covered under, so let's say in this case, so we use us as an example, or healthcare service contractor. We are very familiar with and work with the division very closely on handling complaints that come in for individuals who are have received health coverage under a plan that we insure or that we offer as a healthcare service contractor. And so then it's understood that there's a difference for a complaint that might come into the DFR on behalf of an individual whose coverage comes through a self-insured employer plan. We're acting as the administrator. I just want to, I'd like there to be, I'm going to think about it, and maybe there'd be additional conversation about if that exemption were to be removed, sort of what impact that would have. And there are, I think, important differences in how, the regulator, in this case, the DFR, ought to be looking at a complaint that's coming in, on the sort of self-insured side for that. There's a different relationship there, right, between the regulator and the plan, the group health plan that's actually sponsoring the coverage under ERISA. So it's kind of, even currently, it's kind of a challenging spot for us to be in as both an insurer, I'll use that term even though we're a healthcare service contract, insurer and TPA. So yeah, I just like to put that out there. I guess what would concern me is that if this sort of blurs the line for us who are acting as a TPA, it's always been kind of a challenge to figure out, well, when we're sort of engaging with DFR on those kinds of cases, what's our obligation as a TPA to inform or discuss or bring in the group health plan that's sponsored the plan? And so if that line gets changed or made blurrier and because of this, or if this change were to happen, that it would be a challenging place, and I'd like to avoid that and make sure that we can set kind of the right expectations, I think, for how those would be handled. Maybe I'll just stop on that one and just put that out there.
Yeah, appreciate the comment. So yeah, I think I want to be clear. I think we understand the boundary, right? We do appreciate and understand that it's not the same relationship. The TPA relationship is much different than when you are ultimately the payer, right? I think it's been a sort of a thorn in our side, particularly on the consumer complaints, and I think really specifically within the health insurance universe when we have those issues. One piece of that I think that has come up is, that we've heard concern is, well, we're getting these complaints. For example, I'll give you the example of slow paying claims, which, as everyone knows, we just came through a pandemic. Workforce has been very different than it's ever been. Working conditions have been very different. Everybody had to move. So it's understandable that, there might be some operational issues, but when we're hearing those complaints consistently on the self-funded side of the house, I do think as an insurance regulator, it begs the question, well, is it happening on the fully insured side? I think that's a relevant question for an insurance regulator to ask. But I also want to be very clear, just to address the 500-pound gorilla, right? We're aware of ERISA preemption. We understand that, there's a distinction between regulating a TPA in its capacity as a TPA and trying to reach beyond that and do substantive regulation of the ERISA plan itself. And those two things are pretty close together. So when I bring up the complaint issue, what I would maybe like to see, and I don't know that it needs to be in statute. It could be, but I don't know if it needs to be statute. I don't know if it could be in rule. Maybe it's just a conversation that, and I think we could talk about this more specifically in the health insurance context, but, I think that the overall concern I'm hearing from the division is we would like to get at least understanding it's a self-funded plan, understanding we don't regulate it. We would like to just have a better understanding when we get those complaints and the ability to have more of a conversation than we're having in some cases right now. And part of that, I think, honestly, for us is in the past, that information was a little freer. And in the last few years, we've seen increasingly the responses to those inquiries have been, I'm not saying this literally, but, it's sort of, this is a self-funded plan, go pound sand, right? And we would like to have a little bit, and that puts us in a bad position with our consumer, right? Where we have to go back and say, yes, we're the state's insurance regulator. Yes, you understand this to be an insurance company, but we can't do anything for you. And I think some options, just to be clear, perhaps the response could be things like, here's where the person can go, right? Or making sure that they have that information and reporting that back to us. Those without us necessarily having to get in the middle of it, but that we can feel like we can at least leave that consumer with, here's what you need to do under this plan. Sorry, we can't take any action on this, but here's what you can do. Because sometimes right now we're in a place of, we sort of feel like we can't do anything for them. I hope that makes sense.
No, I mean, definitely helps me better kind of understand your perspective on it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll just say, yeah. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you
Oh,
off.
good.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, for the insurers, I know we do have sort of a standing meeting with just health insurers, so I kind of wanted to broach this today because it is something that's in this sort of universe of what we're talking about with the TPA bill, but I'm happy to have more robust conversation, and so, you know, specific to this issue with the health insurers.
And so then quickly, two other issues and toss out with the removal of that insurer exemption would be, and I'll just put them at this point as things I'm thinking about that, you know, would be just impacts for us if the exemption were removed and we were like obtaining a license as a TPA in addition to our insurance license, would be sort of documentation needs. You know, I'm sure there's some overlap between a certificate of authority and a TPA. So that just adds complexity and maybe additional work for an entity like us who's already gone through some, you know, providing documentation, biographical affidavits, et cetera. And then the other is reporting. So just areas where there could be kind of duplication and might be unnecessary, you know, kind of unhelpful duplication if that were to be removed. So leave it at that. My just kind of initial comments on it.
Appreciate that. Totally hear you and duly noted. Rick Blackwell.
Thanks, Rick Blackwell now for Pacific Source Health Plans. I think I'd support what Dave had said about you know, the separation of response. That makes a lot of sense, and I think we need to understand more what the concept would do there. I'm also curious. If this is an NAIC guideline, it probably won't be an accreditation standard. So do we know how many states in the surrounding areas have adopted these guidelines? I mean, we could end up where Oregon might be kind of unique in the Pacific Northwest in sort of like how we respond to inquiries from one regulator as opposed to others in I mean, like in Washington or Idaho or Montana, where we operate. I think, you know, this could make Oregon quite unique in terms of TPA responses. So curious to what extent these guidelines have been adopted in our neighboring states.
Yeah, I guess that's, yeah. So the TPA model is not new, and most states, I'm going to say most states have adopted it to some degree. You know, the NAIC publishes whenever they do the model laws, they kind of keep a table of, here are all the states that have adopted this. So I want to be clear though on when we're talking about the enforcement piece that I was talking about, so specifically the clarifying the ultimate responsibility for compliance issues. That is we're what I would say is we are below the NAIC model in that area right now. So one thing I think the concept would like to do is bring us up to where we're matching the NAIC model in terms of being clear about who's ultimately responsible and what happens when there's a dispute between the TPA and the insurer. That piece, that's sort of that last statutory section there. That being said, when we're talking about removing the exemptions for health insurers and the self-funded plans, that would, the NAIC model, those are currently in our law and those are currently in the NAIC model. So in those instances, we would be going beyond the NAIC model. And I don't know that we may be the only state that does that. I haven't finished my review, but I've yet to locate another state that does exactly what we are putting on the table here with respect to those, removing those two exemptions. All right, anybody else want to wager a comment or a criticism or an affirmation? I don't know. Yeah, anybody of any stakeholder, regardless. I would say we're at the everyone open table at the moment. If anyone has a question, comment, anything they want to offer at the moment. Okay, well, let's see. Hearing none. Sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to find my. There we are. All right, so let's see. So that was our targeted discussion. I think we're on to next steps. So I think the question I kind of wanted to talk about briefly, I think we definitely probably need more meetings. I think we need to give you all some time to digest this and come up with some feedback. So that can be sent to me. Again, I'm going to send out these slides. You have my email from the invite, but my contact information will be at the end of the slides as well. You can send your feedback to me. I think the question I had was, how do we want to go from here? Understanding that we're getting very close to session, and at the same time we're getting close to the holidays. So I kind of plopped down some options. I had loosely penciled in a second meeting for December 15th. So that would only be about 2 weeks from today, which is quick. And we could hold that meeting, but in order to do that, I think we would want to, just for the sake, I think I would need comments back by the 12th. Option B, I think we could go a little later, and I just sort of tossed out, on or around December 20th. So that would be, that week before Christmas, and that would give a little extra time to get comments in. And then the third option, I think, would be, we could wait, not meet again in December, but try to target an early January meeting and then set a deadline for comments, maybe before Christmas or something like that. I'm not sure what that would look like, but I was just curious, I don't think maybe, I don't know if there's a good way to do voting, but maybe that's something, well, shoot, how do I want to do that? Let's say, well, I guess, yeah, maybe by show of hands. So if folks could, if you're able to, up in their reactions, you can kind of do a little, you can do the thumbs up like I just did. I'm curious if folks would rather try to shoot for the December 15th meeting, if you could just hit any one of the reactions up there to see if folks are interested in that. Seeing literally none, I'll offer the other option, which is how do folks feel if we waited till January, maybe something around January 8th, and we could try to have comments due, I don't know, let's say before we all go off to Christmas. All right, seeing some reactions there. Why don't we plan on that? Just to make it simple. I am going to try to set up another meeting where we come back. Probably not right after New Year's, but maybe like that Monday or that first Monday after New Year's, Monday, Tuesday. And then let's try to have comments back. I have to look at a calendar, but maybe let's say, by Christmas, before Christmas break. And that's not a hard deadline, but just something to kind of shoot for, that we could like to get them back so that I can kind of work on them between that week of Christmas and New Year's, and then we can kind of come back. With that, I'll offer, if anybody just wants to reach out or feels they want to put together more dedicated meetings or has other concerns, I'm here. You can reach me. You'll have my contact information. So yeah, let's go with that. I'll plan to shoot for another meeting early January, and let's try to have comments back. I think it's the 23rd, I believe, is the Friday before Christmas. I think that's correct, but, and I will put that in the follow-up email as far as next steps. We'll plan on another meeting. And I guess unless anyone has anything else for us, I think that's all we have for today. So I think we can adjourn. Going once.
Thank you,
Seeing none.
Michael.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it. Appreciate the conversation.